the visibility mode will control the access specifiers to be inherited members of the base class in the derived class. If it is the visibility mode is public, then in the base class if it is private, then it cannot be inherited. If the base class is public, then in the derived class also it is public only. Then we come on types of inheritance: single level inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hierarchical inheritance as well as hybrid inheritance. Welcome back to one and all. Myself, Vasanta, lecturer in Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. Today, we are going to start with the second session of Inheritance chapter. Whereas in the previous session, you have studied regarding Introduction to Inheritance. That is, inheritance is the process of acquiring the properties from base class to derived class. Then, under that, which are the advantages of inheritance, like easy to maintain, easy to extend, code can be reused. Regarding that advantage of inheritance, you came to know. Then syntax of inheritance, with that you have studied regarding one example program on inheritance. Whereas on today's class, you will come to know regarding visibility mode. What exactly the visibility mode tell you? Under that, private visibility mode, public visibility mode as well as protected visibility mode. There are three types of visibility mode: public mode, private mode as well as protected mode. With that, you will study regarding which are the different types of inheritance. Now one by one we will discuss visibility mode. What exactly the visibility mode will tell you? Whereas the visibility mode controls the access specifier to be inherited members of the base class in the derived class. I am going to give an example. For example, I am going to create one class, the derived class son. This son have the properties. For example, here I am to write public, then father. That's one example. Here this son can take the properties of father because the visibility mode we are given as public. The syntax usually class, then derived class, then afterwards colon, here visibility mode, then base class. This is the general syntax to represent the visibility mode. Is it no? This already you came to know in the previous session. Whereas this visibility mode will tell you whether the data functions of the base class in the derived class can be accessed or not. Regarding that, this visibility mode will tell you. The visibility mode will control the access specifiers to be inherited members of the base class in the derived class. When they come on the types of visibility mode, there are three types: private mode, protected mode as well as public mode. There are three visibility modes: private, public as well as protected. Then if I am going to write on this visibility mode private, then what happens? If I am going to write protected, then what happens? If I am going to write public, what will be the action? Regarding that, it will tell you in the visibility mode. If you observe this table, here consider we have the base class public, protected as well as private. Then inheritance mode, especially here private, protected and public we are given. In base class also private, public, protected. In derived class also we have private, public, protected. For example, here if you observe public, then here what exactly in the derived class it will be? Here if base class members are public, then what will be the derived class members? That one by one this visibility mode will tell you. For example, on this pattern we will explain one by one. See, in public mode, if I am going to write public, especially visibility mode, if I am going to write public, then what happens? The public members in the base class become public in the derived class. And the base class allu public agirutte, on the derived class also it become public. In the base class if it is protected, then it become protected in the derived class also. In the base class if it is private, then in the derived class it cannot be inherited. While explaining on this way you have to explain. See, public, then in the derived class also it become public only. It means that whatever data in the base class, the data become or functions become public in the derived class also. If it is protected in the base class, the members if it is protected, then in the derived class also it is protected only. Then if it is private in the base class, then in the derived class, it cannot be inherited. That is regarding public visibility mode. If I am going to write protected, if the visibility mode in this case, if I am going to write protected, then what happens? Then the public members of the base class become protected in the derived class. Protected members of the base class stay protected in the derived class also. Public members of the base class become protected in the derived class. Protected members of the base class stay protected in the derived class. And private members cannot be inherited in the derived class. Okay. Then in the same way, if the visibility mode, if I am going to write private, then what happens, especially this visibility mode, if I am going to write private once again, then public members of the base class become private members in the derived class. Protected members of the base class become private in the derived class. Then private members in the base class cannot be inherited in the derived class, because in the exam you may want to get the question explain visibility mode for 5 marks. Then you have to write this table. By seeing this table only you can explain one by one. See, public members in the base class, for example visibility mode if it is public, then public members of the base class become public or stay protected in the derived class. Protected members in the base class stay protected in the derived class, and protected members in the base class cannot be inherited in the derived class. Now is it clear? Now one by one we will explain. For example, first we will take public mode. Public mode. Then how exactly here it will say? That is, public members of the base class become public members of the derived class. See, under public members of the base class stay public in the derived class also. That is first class. Public members of the base class become public members of the derived class. Then private members cannot be inherited in the derived class. Private members cannot be inherited in the derived class. That is, private members cannot be inherited to the derived class. And if you observe here, protected members stay protected in the derived class. See here, protected members will stay protected in the derived class. If you see the syntax and example, class, derived class name, colon, visibility mode, then base class. See the example, class, the derived class name we are given as son, then colon, here visibility mode will be public, then the base class here we are given as father. Now is it clear? Then if I want to tell you about regarding private mode, then what happens? Then in private mode also, especially public members of the base class become the private members of the derived class. Public members of the base class become private. If you observe this, public members of the base class become private in the derived class. Then private members cannot be inherited to the derived class. If it is private, then it cannot be inherited. And protected members become private members in the derived class. In the base class, if it is protected, then in the derived class it becomes private members of the derived class. Then here class, the class name, colon, visibility mode, then base class here you have to write. See, on the visibility mode, if I am to write private, then the properties of son, what exactly happens? That regarding that, it will tell you in private mode. And the last one, protected mode. Then on that case also, public members of the base class become protected members of the derived class. What exactly? If the base class, if it is public, then in the derived class it becomes protected. Then private members cannot be inherited to the derived class. If it is private in the base class, that cannot be inherited in the derived class. Then protected members will stay protected in the derived class. In the base class also it is protected, and in derived class also it is protected. Then class, then derived class, then colon, visibility mode, then base class. Then afterwards, here in the example, the class, derived class is son, protected is the visibility mode, then further is a base class. Here what will be the data it can able to transfer. How to remember that table? First of all, if you want, you can remember the table in simple method. For example, in the base class, consider we have base class and here we have derived class. In the base class as well as in derived class, in all the three we have private, public, protected. Write down private, public, protected. In base class also we have private, public as well as protected. In derived class also private, public as well as protected. Three types: private, public, protected. Just to remember, if it is private, it is not inherited. If it is public, whatever heading in the derived class, write on the same headings. Here we have private, write on private only. Here we have public, write on public only. Here protected. Okay, then for protected, only in private case write on private. For the remaining, write on protected only. For the remaining, write on protected only. Like this form, you can able to remember the table. See, while explaining on this pattern, you have to explain. If the base class is private, then in derived class it cannot be inherited. In the base class, if it is public, in the derived class it become private. Protected become private in the derived class. See, while explaining on this way, you have to explain. If it is the visibility mode is public, then in the base class if it is private, then it cannot be inherited. If the base class is public, then in the derived class also it is public only. In the base class if it is protected, in the derived class it is protected. Then for protected case also same pattern. In private, especially in the base class if it is private, then in the derived class it cannot be inherited. In the base class if it is public, become protected in the derived class. If the base class is protected, then in the derived class also it is protected. Like this pattern, you can able to remember this visibility mode. Next, we'll explain the different types of inheritance. When we come on types of inheritance, the first one is single level inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hybrid inheritance, as well as hierarchical inheritance. There are 5 types: single level, multi-level, multiple, hybrid, hierarchical. Whereas in the exam, visibility mode, explain visibility mode for 5 marks you may want to get, or explain the different types of inheritance. That question also carries 5 marks in the annual exam. There you have to write one example with a chart also you have to represent. Now one by one we will explain. Single level or single inheritance. What do you mean by this single inheritance? In this, we have only one base class and only one derived class. For example, father properties are transferred to son. Whereas in the exam, you have to write the explanation with this chart also you have to explain. What exactly the base class and what exactly the derived class. It means that it contains only one base, only one derived. Whereas here, the base class is father, the properties of father is transferred to son. That is single level inheritance. If a class is derived from a single base class, it is called as single level inheritance. And the next one, multi-level inheritance. See, consider we have base class, derived class 1, derived class 2, from that one more derived class. Then here, grandfather properties are transferred to father. Then father properties are transferred to son. It means that this son has the properties of grandfather as well as father. Multi-level. That is, a class can also be derived from the classes that are already derived. This is one derived class. This is one base class. One more derived class. This is derived from already one more derived class. This type of inheritance is called as multi-level inheritance. In multi-level, whatever one derived class, from that one more derived class I can able to create multi-level wise. Then multiple inheritance. Multiple means here more than one base class we are getting. For example, base class 1, base class 2, from that one more derived class. If you observe king, queen, then princess. For example, here father, one base class, mother, one more base class. From these two, one derived class, son. Then it can be called as multiple inheritance. If a class is derived from more than one base class, is called it as multiple inheritance. Now is it clear? The next one is hierarchical inheritance. If a number of classes are derived from a single base class, is called as hierarchical inheritance. For example, only one base class. From this base class, we have 3 derived class. If you want, you can take more than 2 or at least 2 you have to consider. Here, one derived class. This derived class has the properties of class Base class, this one. For example, this is derived class 1, have the properties of base. This is derived 2, this have the properties of base. And this is derived 3, this also have the properties of base. For example, if you consider a college, there staff, lecturers, office staff, then group D, like that we can divide. Otherwise, one more example I can take, father. This father is a base class. From this, consider I am having 3 children, child 1, child 2 and child 3. For example, son 1, son 2 and daughter 1. It means that only one base class, from that multiple derived class you have. Now is it clear? And the next one is hybrid inheritance. Hybrid inheritance. What do you mean by this hybrid inheritance? It is a combination of hierarchical and multiple inheritance. It is a combination of hierarchical as well as multiple inheritance. Consider we have base class 1. From that 3 derived class. From that one more derived class I am getting. Here staff, their lectures, office and staff. From that I am getting one more class, student. It means that it is a combination of hierarchical format. Base, multiple derived and also multiple inheritance. From this multiple inheritance, one more derived class I can get here. For example, father. From that father, 2 properties, 2 child class. For example, one is son and one more is daughter. From that, one more I am getting, for example, X. Then it can be called as hybrid inheritance. These are the few types of inheritance. It means that when we come on types of inheritance, single level inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hierarchical inheritance as well as hybrid inheritance. Then on today's class, you came to know regarding the visibility mode, whereas the visibility mode will control the access specifiers of the data members of the base class in the derived class. Then under that visibility mode, private, public and then protected. And then when you come on types, single level, multi-level, multiple, hybrid as well as hierarchical. Then in the next class, you will come to know regarding what do you mean by abstract class. What is the main use of abstract class? How exactly this abstract class will work? Then how this inheritance will work in constructor as well as destructor. Whereas constructor is a special member function used to initialize the object of a class automatically. In the base class as well as in the derived class, if you have constructor, then which constructor first it will going to execute? On that case, if you have constructor, then base class constructor will execute first, then later on destructor function, especially the derived class constructor, it will going to execute. In base class as well as in derived class, if you have destructor, which one will work? That is, first here it will work in derived class, then later on in base class here it will work. Then how exactly the difference between constructor and destructor, that how exactly it will work in inheritance. Then under that constructor overloading, regarding that you will come to know in the next session. With that you will come to know regarding major questions. That is, what do you mean by inheritance, types of inheritance, visibility mode, then how exactly it will work in constructor and destructor. Regarding that, you will come to know in the next session. Thank you for all of you.